So just to formally begin, good morning, everyone. On behalf of STPI and SEDI teams, I welcome you to this online meeting on how evidence on COVID-19 is being used to support the trade sector. This dialogue series is part of STPI's Strengthening the Use of Evidence for Development Impact SEDI program, in which we are also collaborating with the Ministry of Commerce, FBR, and SAMIDA, as many of you may know. One of the key objectives for today's meeting was that we have been trying to engage on this subject for some time now, and we really wanted to see how the evidence which is coming out is being used, or how it can be better used in the coming days, and with the second wave, of course, coming up. I think the two other objectives which also need to be highlighted, first, of course, what type of evidence is now available to policymakers in the trade and commerce space, and how it can be used to help sustainability of course, the trade sector and the firms in the trade sector. Second, what is the interaction between evidence producers and evidence users? And are there any lessons to be learned from other countries? And of course, we have colleagues from abroad who will be highlighting on this subject as well. And also what evidence use lessons are available from the ongoing programs who had to pivot during the COVID-19 phase. And on this as well, we have colleagues from the bank as well as FCDO who will highlight on this aspect as well. All panelists were requested to provide their inputs on certain questions, but they're of course free to sort of use this space for their overall thoughts on this subject as well. The proceedings for today's meeting are expected to be inputs for SEDI's ongoing collaboration on evidence use with the Commerce Ministry, BOI, and the Ministry of Industries. And I think with this, let me also introduce our panelists for today. Of course, in the interest of time, I won't be able to do justice with the wide range experience which they bring along. But let me, of course, introduce them, of course, in the same sequence in which we plan to run the meeting. We are hoping to start with a brief background to SEDI's work and objectives. And for this, we'll be requesting in a while Ms. Claire Hutchings, who is a team leader for this SEDI program, and also research and data collection methods team lead at the Oxford Policy Management in the UK. After this, we wish to request for her opening remarks, Ms. Rubina Athar, who's the chairperson, National Tariff Commission, Government of Pakistan. She's a very senior civil servant with long-standing experience with the Ministry of Commerce, FBR, and various other government bodies. Very glad that she was able to find time and be with us today. She will be followed by somebody, of course, who's very well respected in this area, also a former civil servant, Mr. Naveed Aziz. He's currently a senior advisor, a senior governance advisor with UK's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, FCDO. He has helped design several initiatives in the evidence space, including the design and implementation of subnational governance program, which many of us know of. After this, I would be requesting Mr. Gonzalo Varela, senior economist at the World Bank Group. He has recently led survey efforts to assess issues confronted by Pakistani firms in the trade sector amid COVID-19, also helped in communicating the firm level responses to the relevant in the government. And of course, he continues to be a force in supporting the reform initiatives at Ministry of Commerce. Also from Ministry of Commerce, we will be requesting Ms. Tayyiba Batul. She has been actively working in both trade and tax reform design, and has been part of teams which have conducted detailed work on FTAs, PTAs, and related assignments. In terms of the timekeeping, all our panelists will be requested for their initial 10 minutes, approximately 10 minutes of inputs. and views on the subject. And after the initial round, once all panelists have given their views, we will be requesting a second round based upon our own supplementary questions, but also questions which may be coming through the chat box. With this, let me request Claire on two specific areas of discussion. First, of course, I would appreciate if she can introduce what SETI has been doing in this space, particularly because SETI brings in a cross-country experience now, this program being in Pakistan, Ghana, and Uganda. And of course, making use of Claire's research and evaluation hat, we would like to know that in times of these uncertainty and crisis, which has no timeline as yet, is the evidence community asking the right questions? It's over to you, Claire.
Thanks very much, Vakar, and thank you everyone for having me. It's a joy to be with you today. I haven't managed to participate in a lot of these because it's very early in the UK, so it's still dark outside and a sleeping family upstairs, but let's see where we get to. So maybe just to first introduce SETI. For those who don't know, SETI, the acronym, stands for Strengthening the Use of Evidence for Development Impact. And the basic premise, I think, is very aligned with these stakeholder dialogues, which is accessing the right information at the right time strengthens policy decisions. And we've been looking a lot at how we do that. Those of you who work in this space will be familiar with the common problem that I think a lot of the focus to date has been on the research system itself. So how do producers of research make their research more accessible, more available? And SETI flips that a little bit and says, actually, we need to start with the decision makers themselves. We need to start with the problems that we're hoping research can help us solve. And SETI is working in, as Vakar said, working in Ghana, Uganda, and Pakistan, really with a demand-led, problem-driven approach. So the idea is that rather than coming to the table with sort of context-agnostic solutions and trialing and testing them, and in tailored contexts, it's really working with decision makers themselves to understand what the problem is and where evidence can support progress and improvement. It sounds simple, but actually incredibly difficult, I think, to see what aspects of problems are best supported by strengthened access to evidence. And so our fantastic leads in each of the countries are working to trial and test different solutions, really emanating from the problems facing policymakers and decision makers in this space. So I am fortunate enough to be the program director for this program, and it's an FCDO program being led out of all 3 country offices, as well as supported by FCDO Central. So we work closely with Naveed, which is great, and nice to have you on the call today, Naveed, as well. Maybe just a little bit of background about myself, so I'll return to introduce myself a little bit better. So I lead the monitoring, evaluation, research and learning portfolio at Oxford Policy Management. And for us, I suppose an underlying premise is that evidence and information really can help drive decisions. So it's very aligned with SETI. But I would say I spend most of my time working out what the right questions to ask and answer are. And where I see research and evidence falling down most frequently is where we don't align that with the questions that are being asked by decision makers. And there is sort of this inbuilt assumption to that approach that with enough evidence, solutions will simply emerge. And I think, in fact, what we recognize is that evidence is one of many factors that influence decisions. It's a really important part, but there are lots of other interests, relevant factors to be considering and negotiating alongside what evidence tells us. And very often evidence isn't specific to the new issue we are facing. So even where it is local evidence, it often needs to be translated to a new local context, translated to a new sector or issue area. And that's not an easy thing to do or straightforward thing to do. So I think the guiding principle that we use to inform our work is that the core questions, getting that question right, is really what determines the relevancy, uptake, and potential use of evidence. Now, in a situation like COVID or any crisis really, I think the challenge is that we are facing huge amounts of uncertainty and ambiguity. It isn't clear what the right way forward is. There's lots of gaps in our knowledge. And a really big one is, what are the right questions to be asking so that we can be gathering the right evidence? And I think that's a huge feature of the current pandemic in all sectors. And health was the original one, but I think it's flowing out into every space. But we're really seeing not only trade-offs in sort of containment or approaches to minimizing some of the acute health crises playing out in other sectors, but we're also starting to see an understanding that other sectors have a real part to play in the response itself. And I think trade and the economic systems in particular are increasingly recognized in that space. So what do we do in a situation where the questions are so uncertain? The evidence base is absolutely emerging, and we are all the time increasing our understanding piece by piece of how the system works. And we're starting to see some strategies come out around that as well. I think the stakeholder dialogues is one strategy that is being used to good effect in lots of different places. There are, the Center for Global Development has recently flagged sort of 4 different types of strategies, and they all respond to slightly different aspects of the problem. So the first one is really this idea of cognitive bias, or the fact that we are already led in some ways by our worldview and our understanding of how things work, and that's a bias in a time of uncertainty like this where the evidence base is so weak. Those are biases we really need to challenge. And so a key strategy for doing that is really a diversity of opinion. So bringing to the table a group like this, where you have many different takes, experiences, lessons learned, biases that we can bring to the table and hash out together. Another one is a very intentional updating of information. So recognizing that at any given point, our information base remains incomplete, and that we need to continue to return to it and look at it. Flexibility in decision making, and I think we're seeing this everywhere. So using a sort of do no harm principle to inform decisions, but trialing strategies and learning from them, and then applying that learning to how we might need to adjust or revisit decisions. And in that, having a huge sort of humility, I suppose, and having a high degree of transparency that allows everyone to understand why we're taking decisions in the ways that we are, what assumptions we are making, and how those inform the decisions, so that when we need to revisit them or return to them or adjust them, there's an explanation for that. So those are some of the strategies, but I think that in terms of accessing the evidence base, that interaction between researchers, between evidence providers and decision makers is really critical. So there is a need in these early days of great uncertainty to really brainstorm many different possible questions that we need to be asking and looking into. And that partnership between sort of the research system and the sector system, in ways that we are looking to collaborate to find the right information to be informing decisions, is very central to that. I think the ways in which we access evidence bases is also needs to be quick and respond to the fast-paced nature of crises like these. And so strategies like stakeholder dialogues are great for that. No, it allows us to access experts and their expertise, and in that way asking a variety of people to act as interlocutors between the questions that we are trying to pose and various different sources of evidence base. Making sure that that group has great diversity helps challenge that cognitive bias piece that we talked about earlier. But also, I think, returning to them. So not seeing those as one-off, job done once we've held that conversation, but seeing it as a partnership that is founded on sort of curiosity and mutual sort of mutual ambition to be coming at the right problems and developing the right sources of evidence, revisiting what we thought we knew as new pieces come in, and doing that in a very dynamic, collaborative, and ongoing way. So, I mean, these stakeholder dialogues in and of themselves are providing SETI with huge amounts of learning about what the right ingredients are. And the pandemic itself, I think, is forcing us to revisit some of our fairly linear, fairly long-term approaches to question identification and solution identification, I think in actually really helpful ways. So putting the power back with the question, putting the power back with the information needs, and really putting research at the service of that question. And I suppose maybe just to qualify that I'm using research in its broadest sense. I think there are a diversity of types of evidence that we want to be using in these spaces. So I think I'll just close there. I mean, I'm really keen to hear from other panelists and to build on what you bring to the table. From my side, what I'm really interested in us continuing to do is identifying the system and sort of context specific barriers. What are the questions we need to be asking at this moment? And I suppose framing trade in particular as a really integral part of the response to this crisis, rather than as an area that is affected by strategies we are using in a health space. Thank you, Vakar. If there's anything that I didn't cover that you would like me to, please do come back to me. Otherwise, I'll hold until the second round.
Yes, thank you, Claire. We'll certainly be coming back to you. And yes, this is very early for you. And I can imagine getting up at 5 a.m. and getting yourself prepared for a Zoom. But really appreciate these thoughts, and thank you for setting the agenda for this meeting. And I'm sure that your points would be triggering, stimulating a lot of discussion in the chat in just a while as we open it up. Let me now turn to Ms. Rubina Athar, and I think we would appreciate at this point her insights on two main points. First, what type of evidence is currently being required or most required by this very important office, the National Tariff Commission, as well as, of course, other institutions in the trade policy space. I think she has been part of most. And we do understand that the evidence needs, research needs, could change drastically as, of course, COVID-19 evolves. And maybe a second question, taking lead from what Claire just mentioned, if there are any barriers to using the evidence in the day-to-day work of NTC, Ministry of Commerce, FBR, and what more needs to be done to build the motivation and capacity to use scientific evidence in trade-related decision-making. So Madam, it's over to you, please.
Thank you, Vakar. Thank you for inviting me for this very useful discussion. And thank you, Claire, for clarifying what all this is about. And I think from the evidence producer's point of view, it was a lot of information for us. So what can be done and what is going on in this area. I think I would rather, and as Vakar has pointed out, would like to say a few things and open the discussion from the evidence user's point of view. I think if we look at specifically the COVID response, I think everybody would agree with me that government's response, the initial response to COVID, was quite quick and appropriate. I think there were many, initially, the government took many decisions like stimulus package and then special salaries for the workers and developing SOPs for workers in factories and then lowering the interest rates. So there were a number of initiatives or the policies the government took in the beginning, which were really useful. And I believe that these were also based on data and evidence, especially with the interaction with the business community. But I think from the user's point of view, what my big concern in this policy making arena for last many, many years is the capacity of the government or the policy makers to use that evidence. And I think over the years, what I have noticed in government is that we lack this capacity. And there are different reasons for this lack of capacity. Maybe I'll just go into the detail later, but for the time being, I would like to say that even when there is good data, the government policymakers' own capacity to analyze this data, and then like the political support for this for the policy is not available. And that's the main reason that good policies are not made in the government sector. So I think what Waqar said, that what type of evidence, definitely, I think so far, what is easy available for decision making or for users is the simple data. And like, for instance, I can give my own example in NTC or in Ministry of Commerce. What we are relying most on is the raw data or the primary data by FBR, Federal Bureau of Statistics. There is some analytical, or maybe I would say evidence-based research available from World Bank, and we are in close contact with Gonzalo, and World Bank has been providing evidence-based research, which we've been using, especially for this tariff policy, and also for the trade negotiations in Ministry of Commerce. To be honest, other than that, this is the first time that I am hearing about SETI. It's I think my ignorance also, but SETI probably has not included the National Tariff Commission and its government bodies which it is interacting with. So I'm first time hearing about SETI. Normally these kind of evidences are not readily available with the policymakers. So I think my one suggestion here would be to make an effort or design some strategies how to make these informations or evidences more readily available to policymakers. I think I'll just stop here and maybe I'll come back later to why we don't have the capacity and what could be done about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam. And yes, certainly, I think these are early days for SETI, and we look forward to interacting more with yourself, seek advice, guidance from yourself and your team on what would be the evidence needs at NTC, and then of course frame the right questions moving forward. But really appreciate your overarching input, particularly around the capacity deficits which you pointed out. And let me now turn to Mr. Naveed Aziz, and I think we would appreciate his insights on two main points, of course, apart from his overall thoughts. The first, of course, what has been FCTO's experience in building the motivation and capacity to use evidence in decision making. And second, I think learning from SNG and other programs, if there are some success stories when it comes to making evidence more accessible to policymakers, something which SETI can bank on or learn from. So Naveed Saab, it's over to you, please.
Ji, thank you, Waqar Saab, and thank you to other panelists, Claire and Madam Rubina, and thank you to the audience for sparing time. So I'll be really brief in terms of questions that you have posed. I would fully agree with Madam Rubina that there are several challenges in Pakistani public sector decision making. Decision makers at times do not have ready evidence available, and even when the evidence is available, we should not assume that it would be used in the way that we think it should be used. And as Claire was saying, making evidence available does not mean that all decisions will be based on that evidence. So in terms of our experience, and those of you who are not familiar with the SNG program, this is a program that we have been running for past 6-7 years now. Phase 1 ended in 2018 and we are now in phase 2. SNG stands for Subnational Governance, and this is being implemented in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and Punjab. We work very closely with government counterparts from departments such as planning and development, finance, local government, and other line departments, including health and education. So this is essentially about improving the public financial management at provincial and district level. Currently, we are working in 18 districts, KP and Punjab put together. The idea is to support local governments once they are in place, but even when the elected party is not in place, we are working with the administrative structures. So that was the brief overview of the program. In terms of our experience in building the motivation and capacity to use evidence in decision making, I think we should, and this is not something new that I'm bringing to the table here, pre-planned templates do not work, and neither do lengthy reports. Senior government officials just do not have time or appetite for those. I think we should really identify and spend a lot of time in doing that. What are their needs? What are their immediate needs? What are their short to medium term needs? And what are their incentives? And that is partly a function of the challenges that they face on a daily basis. So if you go to a typical senior civil servant's office, be it a secretary at the federal level or provincial level, or an official at the district level, their day is mostly spent in what they call firefighting. It's a lot of HR management on ad hoc basis. So they just do not have enough head space to think about things in a strategic manner. So that is why programs by all development partners should spend a lot of time in analyzing and understanding the incentives and needs and the time that they can spend on these things. So I realize that short policy briefs are perhaps more useful than those lengthy reports. And the demonstration effect also works. If you work with them in terms of demonstrating on a pilot basis that evidence can be used to solve a particular public policy problem, then it's easier to scale it up rather than coming with a big bang that we are here to support you to revamp the entire system. That doesn't work. So start small and with the hope that if it clicks and impact is established, it will be scaled up. And I'll give you very specific examples of the work that we've been doing in SNG 1 in Punjab and KP. I hope many people are familiar with this 24/7 ambulance service that runs in Punjab now in almost all districts. Started very small as a pilot in Hafsabad, and with just 15 ambulances which were placed in basic health units. And the idea was to take pregnant women to secondary and tertiary care healthcare facilities if they're an emergency. Because MMR, as we all know, is quite high. Maternal mortality rate in Pakistan is quite high compared with other countries in the region. And one big reason for that is many pregnant women die because they're not taken to hospitals in time. So this pilot started very small in Hafsabad, and in 2 years' time, maternal mortality rate was dropped by 75% in some union councils. So we demonstrated that, showcased that to provincial government, and later on it was scaled up to the entire province. So the appetite is there, but you only have to demonstrate what works. And second example that I would like to quote is this performance management and reform unit that has been established in the Chief Secretary's office in KP. And again, we started very small with the district, started collecting data on 25 service delivery indicators, which was streamed live to the office of Chief Secretary, Additional Chief Secretary in KP. And idea was not to penalize district officials. Idea was to connect them with decision makers in terms of what are the challenges that they're facing on ground. And since then, this has been scaled up to all districts. So all offices of deputy commissioners are now connected live with the Chief Secretary office, and reports are shared using geotagged reports, real-time reports with pictures as evidence in terms of what these officials go out in the field and inspect and report back on. So I would just conclude by saying that I think starting small is always useful. Understanding the needs, incentives, and challenges is even more important. And then demonstration effect works, rather than coming with big bang theories of revamping the entire system. Thank you.
Thank you, Naveed Sab. I really appreciate this. And I think you're very right in saying that things have to be piloted first. And of course, the ambition level has to be in check when dealing with political economy and very complex situation in any public sector department. Thank you indeed. I think this is also a point which we would like to build upon later during this month at the launch of the PEA report. We'll greatly benefit from your advice there as well. Let me now turn to Mr. Gonzalo Varela, and we'd certainly appreciate his insights on not only the ongoing work which they are doing in this space, but also if the trade-related institutions which the bank is supporting, if these institutions need to change the manner in which they are using various types of evidence. Also, we understand that the bank has been involved in capacity building around evidence in trade policy decisions, and we would be very interested to know if there are any structural issues which may have hindered this objective of capacity building around evidence in trade policy at a national level. So it's over to you, Gonzalo.
Thank you, Bakar, and thank you to all panelists for giving me the opportunity to be here. It's a fascinating topic. I would say that this issue of evidence-based policy making, one can think about it particularly in this context. One can think about two main blocks, right? One is about rapid evidence to deal with what is urgent, and then the other block would be evidence to inform decisions that are structurally important. And these two things are slightly different because what you need for one thing is very different than what you need for another. So on the urgent, let me give a couple of examples on the urgent. So the pandemic showed that there were many decisions that needed to be made quite swiftly. And I agree with what Madame Rubina mentioned on some smart decisions that the government took in terms of smart lockdowns, in terms of developing SOPs and not closing down industries for a long time, but developing SOPs and ensuring that they worked under those conditions. And that perhaps was behind the relative stability if you compare with last year of what is happening with exports, which is an indicator also of economic activity. The numbers for exports were relatively promising for the first 4 months of this fiscal year. And in part, that is related to some smart decisions that the government made in terms of opening up in a smart way. There are a number of things that perhaps can be done better when it comes to this type of urgent situations such as this pandemic, and I will mention two or three examples. So one is there is a lot of data available in Pakistan, but the data is not necessarily made available to the right users, right? So, for example, what other countries have been doing to monitor economic activity in the context of COVID-19 pandemic was to look at electricity data, electricity consumption, and to look at night lights that are very quick ways of seeing what is happening with activity in different areas of the country at a quite disaggregated level. So the use of this information can provide a lot of useful evidence on where geographically, in which areas is it that the slump in activity is happening, and therefore where is it that the support is needed, and where is it that you still have activity going on. So these are for example, two ways in which you can use information to inform policy decisions in terms of support to industries, but also to households. There's another example that on which perhaps the government could have used a little bit more of evidence, and is the example of what was happening with export bans on COVID-19 essentials. So a lot of these COVID-19 essentials are related to textile products. So we can think about surgical masks and surgical, wear outfits. So here, this is an area in which Pakistan has a comparative advantage, and an area in which many Pakistani firms quickly started producing, shifting their production processes into this type of COVID-19 essentials. There were some export bans that were imposed, and as more evidence was coming up on whether the domestic market was actually sufficiently stocked, then these export bans were lifted. So one idea here is to monitor more closely and using big data, for example, what is happening with prices. So if you look at what is happening with prices of hand sanitizer, what is happening with prices of surgical masks, then you can see whether there is a lot of those in the market, there is enough, and then you can lift the ban or not. So this is something that easily the government could do, because the data on prices is out there. Countries all over the world use this type of information, so the technology and the data is there. Now, let me move to what is important, right? So what is pandemic or non-pandemic, right? There are certain things that are important to measure and that should be always informing policy making. And let me go back and I will start with the problem. And the problem here is the availability, again, the availability of data. So when it comes, for example, when it comes to trade and when it comes to production, here in Pakistan, we know very little, because there's a census of manufacturing and industries that was conducted in 2015 and 16, but that data is not made available, which means that anything that is based on a survey to try to represent the economy as a whole lacks an updated sampling frame, because if we don't have the census, we cannot have a sampling frame. The data is there, Pakistan Bureau of Statistics has it, but it hasn't been made available to researchers so that they can help policymakers inform their policies. Not everything is negative. So let me give you a couple of examples of our interactions with government officials in which we had quite a productive exchange when it comes to this. And I will mention one case, that is the impact evaluation of the export finance schemes that SBP runs, the export finance scheme and the long-term financing facility. These are large export finance schemes, and the SBP came directly to ask for support to the World Bank in looking into these schemes and evaluating their impact. So we did an impact evaluation, and we found a couple of low-hanging fruits in terms of reforms that could be done to improve the way these schemes were working, and they were very quickly implemented by SBP. Perhaps if one needs to think, okay, what made the difference? Why is it that there we have a success story and perhaps in other areas we don't? So one thing that SBP has is that it has a research department. So it has a research department that was working with us quite actively, and at the same time as we were looking at the data, they were also looking at the data. So we had sort of an independent reality check in many areas, and that came to be ended up being a positive outcome. So there's an issue of capacity that has to do with having the right staff in the institution. I think the National Tariff Commission is another example, example of excellence within the private sector, within the public sector, sorry, in which you have capable people and you have people that are doing a lot of work that is evidence-based, right? But I would mention, and with this I will finish, but I would mention two areas in which I think a lot, and relate to commerce, in which a lot more can be done at relatively low cost. And one is the export promotion initiatives. For example, last year, the government of Pakistan embarked on a Look Africa policy with a trade fair organized in Africa, many exporters, potential exporters coming to Africa to explore opportunities there. Now, the preliminary, the anecdotal evidence shows that there were some good experiences there. Now, what was the government actually making an optimal decision in choosing that location instead of other locations in the world? So there is a lot of information that can be analyzed in order to understand which are the countries in the world that buys the products that typically Pakistan produces, but Pakistan is not selling to them, for example. So we can do an analysis of export potentials and understand which are the regions of the world that would be demanding those products that Pakistan sells, but not yet from Pakistan. That information can be made available to Ministry of Commerce quite easily and could guide decisions in a more efficient way. And let me finish with one more thing that was mentioned on how stakeholder engagements can help in providing information, in providing evidence. And I do agree that stakeholder engagements are very important. But what is also very important is not to confuse lobbying power with reality. And what happens sometimes when one organizes stakeholder engagements is that it depends on how the stakeholders are chosen. And if you choose stakeholders by looking at those that shout the loudest, then perhaps you end up having a bias in the information you get. And so this is why stakeholder engagements are great, but they need to be complemented with analysis of hard data. And that hard data needs to be made available to researchers that can actually look into it. So I'll stop here and look forward for more discussion. Over.
Thank you, Gonzalo. I think the last point was very important when it comes to inclusion in trade policy. And I think something which you have been stressing, and of course we have been stressing from this platform as well, is that not only policies for current exporters, but also potential exporters. Exporters in SME space, in creative space, is also much desired, and evidence, probably the right kind of evidence, probably has the potential to come to the rescue of those sets of firms or those select groups of firms who are usually left out in the process of policy design. So thank you for making that point clear. Let me turn to our final panelist for the first round, which is Ms. Tayyiba Batul. I think it's interesting to note, and Tayyiba, if I recall correctly, that you were in Ministry of Commerce before COVID and after COVID. So I think one of the things which would be very interesting to know from you would be what has changed in terms of evidence use, basically, even the evidence needs of the ministry in during the pandemic, and of course, your thoughts around the questions which were shared over the email as well. So it's over to you, Tayyiba.
Thank you, Dr. Waqar, and it's a very well organized panel, I must say, and the overall session is also going great. Coming to your question, as we all know that trade has been greatly impacted due to COVID-19, and there has been both positive and negative effects. One major impact that has been felt was primarily because of the movement of the goods and the people, because earlier it was free mobility, but post-COVID, the mobility has been pretty much restricted. So borders faced closures and resulted in congestion on ports, leading to dam bridges. So this is for both the exports of Pakistan and the imports coming into Pakistan. A lot of orders faced cancellation, especially in textile sector. As you will recall that during the initial months, about 200 plus orders were cancelled, which amounts to billions, because Europe is one of our key markets if you talk about textile sector, and their demands shifted from textile sector to pharma and mask related things because of the emerging demand in that area. Then remote and online arrangements were put in place immediately to cushion the shock due to COVID-19. So this resulted in a lot of weaker institutional linkages due to movement from the paper-based to paperless environment. Even you'll be recalling that some of the export-related exhibitions that were planned, they were also moved on to the online platforms, though they were very successful, but these were some of the very immediate, based upon the immediate requirements, accordingly keeping in view the needs, changes were brought in so that, the COVID has as much lesser impact on the business, specifically the export community, as much as is possible. And then also it was realized that during these times of pandemic, trade has to be treated as essential because only the essential services were kept open and everything else went into lockdown. So this was treated as essential to save lives and livelihoods. And international cooperations, keeping the whole scenario in front of us, further strengthened to keep the trade flowing. So these were some of the things, I think, which we can look into from the perspective of both the positive and negative impacts arising due to COVID. And then also during these uncertain times, few of the things which were of key importance, I would categorize them into three main areas. First was to boost the confidence of the businessmen, of the exporters in trade, in global markets, by improving transparency about the trade-related policy actions. A lot of those policy actions has been highlighted by Madam Rubina, because those were very timely measures that were introduced by the government. So it was, all those were primarily undertaken to boost the confidence. Then keeping the supply chain flowing, especially of the essential goods like the health supplies, the food supplies. And if we look into the statistics of the exports of Pakistan, the exports which increased in the areas which we see an increase is primarily relating to the food and health supplies. Though some of the countries did had a border closure, but then immediately avenues were explored whereby the borders were not closed and the exports could have been made. those were the lesser developed countries, but still we were able to explore those. And thirdly, avoid making things worse by actually putting in appropriate restrictions relating to the exports, so that we have the domestic demand adequately being met. So these were three things primarily which Pakistan did very appropriately, and also around the world we'll see that COVID actually brought into these three major changes. So Ministry of Commerce, in fact, you will be recalling, that played a very important role in NCOC as well, because despite there were a lot of border closures, but transit trade had to remain open during those times. So we had to contain COVID at one hand, and also keep the goods flowing for this transit trade. So NCOC used to bank on Ministry of Commerce feedback relating to, if we are talking about the evidence that was being generated within the Ministry of Commerce. And in these demand and supply side fluctuations, a close monitoring was being undertaken by the Ministry of Commerce, so that all these timely measures can be introduced to actually keep the goods flowing. In this regard, I must appreciate that the commercial officers actually were playing a very key role, because they were sending reports on daily basis, almost, just to ensure that the exporters gets facilitated. So if we look at the overall things in terms of, as you posed the question, before COVID and post-COVID, so we do see a lot of change, but the key evidence that the Ministry of Commerce looks into, I would say that remained the same, because it's primarily the imports, exports, tariffs. So primarily key features were the same, but building around them, the decisions that were to be taken, they actually were taken keeping in view the scenario of the COVID-19. So those changed. Those decisions that were to be taken, as Claire also pointed out, this very important comment she made, that it's important to ask the right questions. And as I recall Naveed Saab also talking about, that there is no fixed solution that can be actually presented, So you have to improvise, you have to tailor your things based upon the situation that arises. So COVID actually led people at the Ministry of Commerce, all the officers at the Ministry of Commerce, to tailor their decisions based on obviously the same data, but in the light of this new scenario that we had. And it was definitely challenging, because at one hand we were asked to stay at home, and at the other hand we had to come to the office as well to ensure that these essential flows keeps on going. And in this way we can see, for Pakistan specifically, and overall also in the world, that there were certain things that we can see as progressively moving forward. For example, the demand shifted from textile to pharma. So this led to shift in entire supply chain, and hence the trade accordingly molded, keeping in view this demand shift. And secondly, the countries became protective, such as if we look into the example of ethyl alcohol. So its exports were allowed in limited quantities only, so that the domestic demand can also be met. And we have also enough supplies. So there was, for certain things you were showing progressiveness, and for certain things you were showing yourself as a restrictive country. But those were the needed measures. And as again, I would say that the evidence that is obviously going to be the same. And one thing keeping in view, now that we are talking about the evidence, how could that be further improved? From my experience, all these various that I had, I remember that at the government of Punjab, we were making the decision support system overall. And then also at the FPR, I had those thoughts relating to the decision support system. So, in that decision support system, if we look at all the various layers of the data that we have to be able to devise sound evidence-based policies, then it's primarily, accounting for all the settlements data that we have, the energy-related data, all the power plants, the transportation structure that we have, the overall climate and geology, and then the data relating to agriculture and mining, and then data relating to the health facilities and the educational facilities, the investment, the trade, the FBR's data, which is comprising of all the tax-related information. So we do have all this data in different pockets available with us already. And one data set that I haven't spoken about that's deliberate, it's about the industry data. We do have all the different pieces of this puzzle, but we have yet to form one picture that can inform us, not for just, next 2-3 years, but we can then accordingly make our plannings across decades. Though we'll keep on improvising, but we have to have such a completed puzzle whereby or through which we will be informed to make our policies for decades. And one missing piece that we have in all these data layers that are available is that of industry. As Gonzalo rightly pointed out, that Pakistan Bureau of Statistics does conduct the surveys. It did for 2010, it did for 2015, but those data sets are not available due to their reasons, which are all valid reasons. But it's time, I think, that we address those reasons and come to the solutions so we have a good industrial data as well. So this will actually inform better decision making at the Ministry of Commerce, at the FPR, at the National Tariff Commission as well. Because I was going through this very interesting report by Madam Rubina, which is her work on sectoral analysis for calculating the tax potential, which was conducted by her back in 2010-11. So such kind of potentials could be worked out for not just tax, but for trade, for investments in future, if we have the requisite data available and all the data layers combined in one complete picture. Thank you, Dr. Waqar.
Thank you, Tayyiba, and we will come back to you in just a while on the future needs. Now, as I go back to our panel for a quick second round, I think there are two requests. One, of course, is that there are some questions being posted in the chat box as well as we go along. And in the interest of time, of course, we may not be able to take all of them here, but in case our panelists feel the need to respond to any of them here, please feel free to do that. And I think just to update, taking lead from Tayyiba, so one of the things which we had we had discussed very early on in these stakeholder meetings right after the pandemic outbreak was how the Commerce Ministry officials could receive quick inputs around the safe trade SOPs, safe transport and logistics SOPs. And I think, Tayyiba, you'll be pleased to know that we have made some progress with the Pakistan Institute of Trade and Development on this subject. And this month there will be there'll be an expert who is going to design something very short term, which will only be looking at safe trade in agriculture sector, not the whole of trade sector. But as Naveed Saab was pointing out, we let this be a very small start and maybe take the overall safe trade subject later during our collaboration with Bitad. So Claire, I'll come back to you now. And I think, of course, you have heard the other fellow panelists. So we will appreciate in case there are any sort of additional responses. But also, I think if I can request one supplementary question from our side, which is whether you're seeing a difference between what policymakers are asking in the three steady countries, which are Pakistan, Uganda, or Ghana. As I understand, of course, they would be at different stages of embracing COVID-19 or the new normal, as we are trying to call it. But that's one supplementary question which comes to mind, if you can also take that. And maybe if you would like, also if you could highlight if there are any learnings from the past programs around evidence use, which could help in plugging or addressing some of the gaps which were pointed out by Ms. Rubina Athar and Mr. Naveed Aziz around the capacity to use the evidence. So if there are any past learnings, that'll really help. So it's over to you, Claire.
A tall order and lots of really important points made by all of the panelists that I wanted to pick up on in not in a terribly coherent flow. I mean, I think one of the really important pieces that came through from a few of the panelists is this acknowledgement that our response to this crisis builds on the systems we have in place. No? So we aren't building from scratch, and there's lots of inherited challenges, much of which I think are around siloed thinking between different sectors and different departments. And how we, but also this application of use, the very narrow definition of evidence being used by some actors in this space, how we broaden that, and of course the capacity constraints that have been flagged, and I'll come back on to. So I think that's a really useful and important point, and SETI has started with this sort of mapping of the landscape, if you like, and many of the issues, although picked up pre-COVID, remain very relevant in terms of how collaborations are working, where there's gaps in capacities, but also really importantly, this issue of incentives and incentives to use evidence. No? So I want to just flag that. I want to, I mean, I think one of my big takeaways, and this comes from past learning as well, so if we're taking your prompt on that, this problem-driven approach to research and evidence, and the collaboration between sort of researchers and policymakers that Naveed touched on as well, I think is a really critical learning. So, you know, there was a World Bank study that was done in, I think, 2012 now, but it looked at some of the policy papers that the World Bank had published. And it revealed nearly a third of them had never once been downloaded, and more than 70% of them had been accessed fewer than 100 times. And I think it speaks to this idea that it's not just about the evidence, it's really about the incentives to use it and how aligned that is. And there's lots of challenges now around greater adoption of evidence. We crave sort of certainty that we expect evidence to be able to provide, and it often doesn't. What policymakers need to do is reach a judgment that is evidence informed, and very rarely will the evidence tell us what that decision needs to be. There's often several right decisions that are all equally policy informed, but involve choices and trade-offs between a variety of different influences on policy space. But I think it's also really easy for us to ask very irrelevant questions. And so for me, this big takeaway is that interactive collaboration between research systems and between decision makers and policymakers, and how we get that right. And Naveed, I like your prompt on sort of, it's not so much proof of concept for scale, it's more around that demonstrator effect. Can we show ways in which evidence can be not technical, not scary, not big, but incremental and useful, and really demonstrate that usefulness. I think, Vakar, in terms of what we're seeing across the three countries, and this is by no means an exhaustive representation of policy asks, but I think there are some similarities in the sense that we are seeing ambitions by governments in all three countries and government departments to break down silos and to recognize the value of bringing together industry data that's been mentioned with statistical data, with sort of stakeholder perceptions and more rapid feedback on the changing dynamics. I think there are different strategies being used to trial that, but there seems to be a recognition of the importance of that. I think there is a much bigger drive in Ghana and Uganda for working out, for building up rather than importing maybe strategies from Europe and elsewhere. But in either way that you approach that policy conundrum, we're in a space now where those initial strategies are being questioned, where their appropriateness and suitability to context are being looked into, and where we are tailoring based on very different needs. You know, even within Europe, which is the context I know well, we've got very different strategies playing out in different places that represent different judgments based on evidence and trade-offs based on values and sort of current circumstances. So that idea that evidence is one piece of the puzzle, no, but that judgments are made of a variety of pieces, I think is very important. I also just want to touch on, and maybe I'll end here, in fact, is this issue of capacity and tying it very squarely with incentives. So I recognize, Manor, you've put a good question in the chat around an experience or a trend, which is pieces of work being funded by development partners, and then maybe the sustainability or applicability or relevance of that dropping away when the funding drops away. I think that does speak to incentives as much as anything. So where we see gaps in evidence and capacity, you know, a simple next step is to say, let's fill those gaps and let's fill that capacity. But I think really important to pause and understand why we have the gap in the first place. So why are we not investing in those capacities? Why are we not investing in that evidence? What's stopping us from bringing these diverse sources of evidence together and really grappling with that incentives issue in a way that is owned and where solutions are tailored to an understanding of that? I think the assumption that the barrier is purely financial is very rarely the case. We are making decisions all the time about what we prioritize to fund and resource. And if we see gaps that are important enough, I think understanding why we have that situation and what we can do to fix it, which isn't just capacity development, but really integrating capacity as a priority and as a sort of funded priority, but also as a sort of an internal policy agenda. I am not sure that I've answered all your questions, Vakar, so very happy for you to come back to me if I've missed any of them. But yeah, thank you so much to everybody. I've learned a lot from listening to you.
Thank you, Claire. And yes, you have touched upon most of the questions. And I think I will take lead from your point, which of course connects on capacity, and move to Ms. Rubina Athar, because I think she was very right in saying that this has to be a longer term goal around building capacities around evidence. So one of the things that I think she's probably best placed in the panel to answer is something which Gonzalo was also referring to. How should we sort of make the reform of public statistics a priority? We have seen a lot of experimentation with the PBS or with the provincial statistics bureaus. Of course, you have been an evidence and data user as somebody who worked for so many years in FBR. So that's one. The second thing which comes to mind is what Tayyaba was mentioning about your work in 2010. So I think the team that was there in FBR had started these very timely, informative knowledge products back then, including a policy journal of FBR, a quarterly bulletin, was institutionalized, there was a data warehouse available which used to provide open data access on revenue collected by sectors at a very disaggregated level, going even up till 1950s, going as back as 1950s. Now, somehow, the sustainability of these initiatives remains a challenge. Things have been a function of how motivated an individual was, and maybe as an individual moves, things may sort of shut down. So how does one bring sustainability in whatever we sort of experiment around evidence use in the public sector? And then finally, and I don't know whether you would like to sort of touch upon that or not, but I think you talked about the political motivation as well in your earlier segment, that how motivated is the political leadership to use scientific evidence, to demand the scientific evidence. And I think if our past work in this area is of some guidance, there's so much of evidence which was produced around regional trade, around the gains which one could sort of accrue with boosting trade with our neighbors, both on the eastern side and the western side. Still, however, we continue to trade with partners who are far, far away from us, you know. So that's this is just a footnote, but I think my questions are those which are around the sustainability of your efforts in the evidence space. It's over to you, please.
Thank you, Waqar. I think you have touched on my very sensitive issues, which are very dear to my heart since working in this area for years. I think when I say about capacity, what I really understood from my experiences, that within the government, there are no organization which is specifically for policy making. If you look at Ministry of Commerce, if you look at FBR regarding trade, they are at the same time policy makers and implementers. So when you are the implementer, naturally the policy making takes a second preference. So implementation is the more preferences for implementation. So whatever policy making, it goes to the backseat. And what we have seen over the years in government is that most of the policy making and this evidence is dependent on either the international organizations, the donor organizations, or consultants in the market. There is no in-house capacity in any policy-making organization. And I think that's what you mentioned in FBR. When they were private members in FBR, all this work was done. Of course, I was the permanent staff of FBR. And I think at that time, we tried to develop in-house capacity. The same thing I'm trying to do right now in NTC. We're trying to develop in-house capacity. Now, the problem in developing in-house capacity is, I think Claire mentioned some other issues, but let me just tell you, finance is the major constraint in developing in-house capacity. No government organization, like for instance, I can say in NTC, there is not a single penny for staff training. So whatever training we are giving to our staff is either given by World Bank or any other donor organization. So I think, and then there is no incentive. There is no incentive for the government officers to go for this route, for this skill development or evidence analysis and research and development. So you don't see any government officer keen to have such kind of training and skill development. They are basically managers. and they prefer to be managers. So I think what mostly required right now is to build in-house capacities for analysis. And secondly, what Waqar, you rightly said, there is need for political support and political will to go to that route. And as experienced, through my experience, I can say that even if you have good data, you do good analysis, it's evidence-based, even then the policies are mostly not implemented because of the political support. I could give you a recent example, and I think Gonzalo would be aware of that in the current budget, we, after a very thorough, deep analysis, developed a tariff rationalization plan for the iron and steel sector. But because of the political interests and strong vested interests and lobbies, this couldn't get through. So similarly, I think in trade especially, the major work that I'm right now doing, National Tariff Commission, is the tariff policy. And I see every day, like these kind of lobbying and vested interest, which do not support the changes that we are trying to propose and which are the right thing to do at this moment. So I think these are the issues, and for the long term, I think the policies, I think there should be a close interaction between the evidence producers and evidence users. As much closer this interaction is, we expect a better outcome. And of course, this political, I think, support that we need, and we need some voice, some strategies to make the governments and the other business communities to understand how important this evidence-based policy making is. Otherwise, we will. I think it's that we had the COVID response, a very appropriate response, but I don't see this kind of interaction or this kind of policy making in the long terms. So we need people in their respective spheres to emphasize the need for this in-house capacity building in policy-making organizations. Thank you.
Thank you indeed, Madam. I think this was very insightful, and your point, I think, around the budget, the procurement of in-house capacity is something which is really coming again and again, and not just from NTC. I think we hear this from all the other departments as well, and I think there are, of course, learning from the evidence, there are solutions which one could, of course, discuss in a follow-up discussion on this very subject. But in the interest of time, I do see that we have around 12 more minutes left. So I have 3 questions for our remaining 3 panelists. So let me turn to Naveed Sir. So I think Mr. Naveed Aziz rightly mentioned the need to pilot something small and then, of course, take the learnings from there to develop something which is more comprehensive. So my question to you, Naveed sir, would be that one of the things or one of the constraints that we face in doing something like this is the frequent turnover of our colleagues in the public sector, staff, civil service in the public sector. So you would experiment with somebody at a smaller scale, and in no time you would see them move from there, even before the stipulated time which the law allows. So I'm sure that your experience would not have been different, but I'd just like to know if there are ways to circumvent or to minimize some of this risk.
Thank you, Waqar. I think you've really touched on the core issue, and this takes us into the territory of civil service reforms or how the civil service works in this country. So I totally agree with you, but I think what we have learned from our experience, and this is of course not the ideal situation and it's suboptimal, that you work with the middle tier who tend to stay a bit longer. And my apologies if my arguments are not from, or my experience is not from trade per se, but I think some issues around public sector management cut across. So hopefully this will sound relevant to the audience. Giving you the example of health, the pilot that we tried in Hafzabad district, the team put in a lot of effort of working with district health officials below grade 17, because in a lot of government departments, that is the tier that actually runs the affairs of the government. And in most cases, they are the public face, be it tax department or any other civil or service delivery department. So a lot of time was spent with people who were working at that level, and that I would not say guaranteed, but provided more chances of continuity. And once a system or a pilot starts working, and as you know, success has many fathers, everyone then starts to become a champion. So, and during the course of 2 years, there were 3 different deputy commissioners posted in Hafzabad. And luckily, all of them were impressed and championed the cause. And then one of them went on to become Secretary Health later. So that was another good coincidence, or we were lucky. And then he propagated and championed this cause before the chief minister, and that's how it was scaled up. But most of the times, several interventions cannot be that lucky. So I confess that, and I agree. But in our experience, it was I think a good investment to work with the middle and lower tier. Otherwise, if you want to solve the problem of turnover, Madam Rubina is with us. She spent I think a lifetime in civil service. You can't address that through one intervention or two. You would have to revamp the way civil service works in this country.
Thank you, Naveed Sahab, and thank you for highlighting the Hafzabad example, something which we plan to study in detail as well. We'll be in touch with you on this. Gonzalo, very quickly, I think I wanted to touch on your presentation in May. If you recall, we had met on a very different subject in which you had shown the results from the firm level survey which the World Bank had conducted. Now, one of the things which you had highlighted was that amongst those other types of costs which the private sector talks about or trade sector firms talks about, the less talked cost is around information. How does the private sector procure or get the right kind of information during times of uncertainty and crisis? And you had highlighted that how significant, in monetary terms, how significant these information costs could be for the private sector. Now, my question to you would be, are we now looking at, or are we now arriving at a point where policymakers are telling us that even they have high information costs in order to respond to the crisis?
Thank you, Bakar. So the short answer, clearly, yes. Actually, the public sector has much higher information costs to respond to the crisis than the private sector has. In part because they have different incentives. So the private sector has the incentive to look immediately for that information, right? Because their profits depend on that. For the public sector, the incentives are a little bit different, right? But certainly in this context, in this context in which decisions need to be taken immediately, then the public sector is facing really high costs of finding information. And one of the things that we saw, at least at the beginning of the pandemic, is that the shortcut for that problem with having the right information at the right time was just imitate what other countries are doing. And so we saw sort of a domino effect of many measures that were happening in our countries that were imitated in say, in the case of Pakistan or South Asia in general, in East Asia, because countries didn't have access to information, so the best bet they had was to imitate what others were doing. But my short answer is yes, there are high costs for the public sector obtaining information, and a way of dealing with that is to make use of the sources that they have available and that they produce on a regular basis more efficiently, and give access also to others, because information is to some extent a public good. Once the information is out there, it's very difficult to exclude others from using it. So if the government has some sources of creating that information, putting that information on the table, everybody will benefit. So I'll stop here.
Thank you, Gonzalo. And finally, Taiba, if we can quickly request you for an update around the trade policy, or if I can say the current cycle of trade policy as it stands in the Commerce Ministry. We have seen strands of this trade policy come through in the form of national tariff policy. We have seen an e-commerce policy come through. But where does the overall policy exercise, which is usually known as the STPF, Strategic Trade Policy Framework, which is for the medium term stand, if you can just quickly update, and then we move towards closing our proceedings.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Waqar. As far as the strategic trade policy framework is concerned, one thing that I would like to highlight is that the earlier strategic trade policy frameworks were the medium-term frameworks for 3 years, and this the fourth STPF is going to be a 5 years framework. So it's going to be for 2025. Though a little delays were faced due to the change in the administration at the secretariat level. So we'll be hoping that, in this month or the next, it will inshallah be announced. So it will actually be covering overall all the sectors, all the sectors, and, 2 of its components have already been released, as you have highlighted. So, but this will be encompassing the overall sectors, plus it will be having a good M&E framework as well devised, so that, as you'll be aware, that the earlier frameworks were not actually, very well implemented because of a weaker M&E framework associated with it. So, but this time we are hoping that, the M&E framework is also a robust, so that, the policy is implemented well, and as well as its fruits are also seen in the coming days.
Thank you, Taiba. I really appreciate this update. And if there's any help which this group can provide with the monitoring and evaluation framework around this policy, we'll be happy to help discuss. Let me, of course, thank our colleagues who have joined us as panelists today, but also those who joined us as the attendees and participants. I understand that this is a subject which really requires a lot of labor of love to actually join, discuss, and of course, post inputs. But I'm really grateful to Claire, Ms. Rubina Athar, Mr. Naveed Aziz, Gonzalo, Ms. Taiba Batul, as well as my colleagues from the SEDI as well as STPI teams for bringing this together. Just in terms of the way forward, a recording of this meeting will be available for you, of course, with the permission of all, in case you would like to circulate this across your department or the institution for any wider audience as well as feedback. We also transcribe these proceedings, and a summary of our policy conclusions would also be shared with the Ministry of Commerce as well as the other relevant departments in the trade policy space, including FPR and NTC. And we will be uploading any blog posts which would, of course, be coming out of this session. We usually have 1 to 2 blog posts that come out of our sessions, and these will be uploaded on the SEDI webpage at STPI's website. So once again, let me thank all of you for your time and your thoughts, and we will of course come back to you with a follow-up discussion on this and hopefully soon. Thank you very much.